Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session. My name is John Maketo. I'm here as the moderator of this session today that's focusing on the nexus between debt and kleptocracy in the world that we live today. And debt crisis is one of the situations that confronts us world over, particularly countries in the global south. And not only that, there is a growing nexus of debt crisis with issues of corruption, accountability, and transparency. And our session today will be focusing exactly on that. We are going to talk about how we got here, why we are here, what's the situation like, and we are going to hear country experiences. We are also going to hear about possible solutions on how to confront the crisis of klepto debt in different countries and how we can assist one another from country to country, region to region, and the role of civil society particularly, and also how different state actors can actually chip in to assist. To help me discuss this particular topic, I've got colleagues here who I'm going to give an opportunity, 30 seconds each to introduce themselves and where they're coming from. So I'll start with you, Gary.
Sure, thanks, John. My name is Gary Kalman, and I direct Transparency International US.
Morning. My name is Beloved Chiweshe from Accountability Lab, Zimbabwe.
Good morning. I'm Nadishani Pereira. I'm the Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka.
Morning. My name is Pablo Secchi. I am the Executive Director of Poder Ciudadano, TI Argentina.
Thank you very much, gentlemen and lady, for being part of this very important panel. And to state the conversation, I'm going to invite Gary. Can you help us to unpack how did we get here? Why are we talking about a debt crisis today? How did we get here? Why is it happening? And can you just get us started?
Sure. No, thanks for the question. I think it's important to understand where we're at because I think, and sort of the evolution of how we got here, because I think it can help us understand how we might be able to address some of these problems. You're going to hear from my colleagues who are in countries facing debt crisis and some of the truly challenging situations they find themselves. But to fully understand where we're at and how we move forward, we need to cycle back, and we could go back to the beginning of the IMF and the World Bank. I'm not going to do that, but just if people remember, about 25 years ago or so, we were in a situation where we had very high levels of debt, unsustainable debt. Numerous countries were facing a debt crisis, and with the help of some celebrities like Bono and the Pope, there was a push that was successful in eradicating over $100 billion of debt in the emerging markets and developing world. And everybody celebrated. It was called Jubilee 2000. And everybody thought, yay, we had solved the problem. Unfortunately, 25 years later, we find ourselves with debt levels that are nearing, as a percentage of GDP, nearing the same levels of crisis that we had before. And you have to go and ask, why is that? And one of the key reasons is that in the lead up to the debt crisis, there was a lot of aid, there was a lot of loan money, there was a lot of bond money. Unfortunately, because of corruption, a lot of it was stolen and misspent. And therefore, when we erased the debt, these countries they didn't have sustainable economies, and therefore they immediately needed to raise more money, and they were loaded up with debt. But because the IMF hadn't learned from its mistake, it gave money without any kind of governance requirements. And so once again, 25 years later, as a surprise to no one except the IMF, here we are facing a situation in which somewhere, depending upon which list you look at, between 60 and 90 countries are either in debt distress or facing high risk of debt distress. The So that's the bad news. The good news, I think, and what gives us some opportunity to talk about some of the solutions today is the following. And that is, in 2003, IMF staff came out with a report, and they literally said that governance reforms, democracy, transparency issues are not part of their mission. Over the last 15 years or so, and leading to 2018, following the Panama Papers and a number of exposés understanding the role of corruption, a lot of good work from people in this room, certainly Transparency International, my organization, and others, corruption is now seen as a much larger factor in driving poverty. And in fact, in 2018, the IMF came out with a statement saying that corruption is, in their terms, quote unquote, macro critical. And so we are now facing an IMF in which they understand the role of corruption. I think there is still a lot of work to be done on our part to push them to make sure that they really hold countries accountable. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's both why we're at where we are today, but also a reason for hope.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary, for outlining that. I'll invite Nadshan. What has been your experiences? Can you just share with us?
Thanks. What we use as the working definition of corruption, as we all know, is the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. And in Sri Lanka, I say this has gone to the next level, where we see over the decades, it's not just like this last government, there is a thriving kleptocracy. Which again, in very simple terms, we say ruled by thieves. But it is this thieves, meaning it's just not the politicians, but it is a group. Senior public officials, the business sector, the enablers, the lawyers, the real estate agents and accountants, and of course, criminal network. So when we see that, when I say that my country is having a thriving kleptocracy, what I am saying is that those who are ultimately, who are the real power holders, there is this group. And when this group has the power over the nation, they take decisions in their best interest, not in the interest of the country. Now, just before I tell you what happens with debt, we have gone to the next worst level, a very serious form of corruption. That is where these kleptocrats become so powerful that they are able to capture the system, capture the arms of the government, what we call state capture. They are able to pass laws, bring in policies, change these, bring in new laws just for their benefit at the cost of the entire nation. So you're talking about a dysfunctional system where the executive has captured the legislature, and they are trying as much as they can to influence the judiciary, other independent commissions, suppress civic space, civil society, roll back the democratic framework, because these things upset their big plan of state capture is towards their private gain. Now imagine in this state, it is part of the kleptocrats' playbook that public debt is used for their political projects. This is what we see in Sri Lanka, because after all, they are able to decide on massive public debt. We are binding the citizens for generations. I mean, most of the parliamentarians in our country are like older than 55 years, so they're not going to even live to see the end of this debt being paid. However, they are taking these decisions, and in fact, it is the ministers, because either it doesn't even go through parliament, it's not even debated, or the parliament gets a direction, this is the project of the president or the minister, you just need to raise your hand. Nothing to do about Parliament representing us. So it is, you're talking about the debt that is taken even from bilateral donors to the international financial institutions to, of course, the private creditors. But they are all signing contracts with a well-known, worldwide known corrupt regime that is not, that has disrupted the accountability framework of the country. So the law enforcement is struggling to hold them accountable. The legislature is unable to. The citizens are quite helpless. And the civil society that is trying to question and asking for some transparency about who took what debt, for what purpose, when were we consulted, and on what terms are being harassed, and even legally, there are many attempts to bring in laws to make it unlawful for us to do this job. So in this framework, and I like to bring in the very critical other factor about Sri Lanka's debt now. Now, I know Sri Lanka became popular as a country that ran into a debt crisis, the simple word to use, and then declared bankruptcy in 2022. Yeah, it is the foreign currency, foreign reserves hitting a zero, and we been unable to pay our external debt, and actually 50% is actually domestic debt. Again, not sure who made these decisions and how. It is a debt crisis, but even the ordinary citizens understood that there was a governance crisis that led to the debt crisis. Because it was not the tsunami, it was not the war in Ukraine, it was not a natural disaster or COVID that made us hit a bankruptcy situation. It was a series of decisions that the government continued to take, disregarding advice from independent actors. And this was confirmed even by this landmark Supreme Court decision, where some of us went to court seeking accountability for the economic crisis, where the court held the former president, prime minister, finance minister, central bank governor, and the monetary board accountable for the economic crisis. So now, the whole point of if the debt crisis was caused by a governance crisis, when you talk about governance crisis, you're talking about corruption. Corruption at a very high level. I mean, high level, grand corruption, where the system is rigged, not just talking about petty corruption. If we don't address that, the root cause of the problem, and we go ahead with the IMF agreement has now come. Yes, we are getting some breathing space with this money, but if we are not going to address the root cause, that the corruption and the abuse of public resources, the violation of the public trust doctrine, which the court said when they held these high persons accountable, because these positions hold public resources in trust for the nation. They are not the owners, they are the stewards. So if we don't address that, we are going to go into another debt crisis in a couple of years. It was the 17th time that we reached out to the IMF. So in a way, we need to feel ashamed that we had to go there. That means the debt has not brought about any sustainable solutions because we did not address the corruption problem. So this time around, and I think my time is up, but we can continue. Civil society stepped up. As you may know, we had an unprecedented people's uprising, where people went to the street, demanded the resignation of the president, but the main realization or the social awakening, what we call at TISL, was that people connected grand corruption and abuse of power at the highest level in the way they managed the economy with their day-to-day lives. Because we were all stuck at home, no fuel, no electricity, food, medicine. The country came to a standstill and people were like, this was man-made. We want a system change. We want to end corruption. We want the recovery of stolen assets. These were normal slogans that were held by the protesters on the ground. So this realization was there, and that helped us to mobilize a wider spectrum of civil society, working on different sectors: environment, child protection, women, social protection, where they all came and said, first things first, let's address corruption and let's address the governance problems, because if we don't fix this, we cannot achieve any other human rights. And we came together and we pressurized the IMF, saying you cannot go ahead with an agreement with only economic targets when you also know that the root cause is the governance problem. So there has to be some essential governance reforms that are part and parcel of the agreement. So we can take the conversation.
Thank you very much, Nadishan, for that intervention. And I think the key takeaway is that the linkage between governance issues and the debt situation in your country. I want to get over to Pablo to share with us from your experiences as well. What is the importance of transparency in debt issues for a country like Argentina?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. I will give you a brief of the history about Argentina relationship with debt, that it's a big problem for us. Argentina has gone through several debt crises throughout its history, some of the most notable being those in 1982, in 2001 and 2020. The 2020 default was one of the largest in the history and left deep scars on Argentina economy and society. Argentina, for your information, made more than 25 agreements with the IMF. In 2018, the country signed an agreement with the International Monetary Fund for a record of $57 billion. This agreement looking for stabilize the Argentina economy and face an imminent financial crisis. However, the conditions imposed by the IMF were very strict, and Argentina has had difficult to pay the debt. We are in the same problem during this time. However, Argentina continues to face structural economic problems, high inflation, low economic growth, and a persistent fiscal deficit that are factors that complicate the country's ability to generate the revenue necessary to meet its debt obligations. But I want to point some problems in the public debt management in a country like Argentina and other countries or poor countries that have a big problem with the economy. First of all, I think that we have an insufficient legal framework. Laws regulating public debt are often unclear or incomplete, making it difficult to manage and control all debts. Not just those that of the central government. You know, we have some countries, my country is a federal country that have problem with the debt in the main government and in the federal government. Other point is the lack of transparency. Information of public debt is insufficient and is not adequately shared between institutions, making accountability and informed decision making very difficult. We have limited citizen participation. Citizens do not have enough access to information or opportunity to participate in decisions about public debt. And the same problems were identified by the IMF. Then they talk about inadequate transparency. Many times the lack of transparency in public debt is due to problems in institutions and generate negative incentives, especially in developing countries. This leads to incomplete debt information, say the IMF, and make it difficult to authorities to be accountable for their decisions. And the monetary funds say too that there are limited information and accountability. The lack of clear and accessible information on public debt allows authorities to make harmful decisions, such as accepting unfavorable debt conditions that was what happened in my country many times. But we have some recommendations to finalize. Transparency International and the National Democratic Institute make some recommendations, especially about development and of appropriate regulatory frameworks, that it's crucial to create clear laws that define all type of debt.
Sorry, Pablo,
Yes.
I want to hold you before you talk about the recommendations. I'll come back to you.
Yeah, sure.
I need us once more to get to unpack the real problem so that we can speak to solutions that address that particular problem. I believe, I guess you represent Sub-Saharan Africa here. What are the experiences, all of Sub-Saharan Africa? I think over 60 countries, they are in debt crisis or at a high risk of being in debt distress. What are your experiences as accountability level?
Thank you, John. I think to our topic, we have kleptocracy and we have debt. I would want to add two more important words to the topic around strategic corruption and also sanctions. And to build on what Gary talked about regarding IMF, for a country like Zimbabwe, where I come from, which no longer has capacity to borrow from these international financial institutions, I think we have had enough conversations at this conference around sanctions and the veracity of them. But I think the implications on debt are important. As a sanctions-busting mechanism, as they call it in our country, they have resorted to other resource-based loans, where kleptocracy now has been demonstrated in ways that are beyond question. In the soft coup, the coup that was not coup in 2017, the military and politicians who removed Mugabe, their allegation was that they were removing criminals around the president, which means that the fact that the government has kleptocratic tendencies had been proven beyond doubt by the politicians and the military itself. As part of the sanctions-busting mechanisms and resource-based loans, lots of opportunities for personal and primitive accumulation have emerged. So unlike the IMF-based system, these new mechanisms of resource mobilization by countries facing crisis create opportunities for self-enrichment and other corrupt practices that I think would be of interest to participants here. Since it's a way to evade the formal system, it comes clothed in informality, creating opportunities for whoever is negotiating these contracts to enrich themselves, to enrich their political parties, or to ensure that the political system is just corrupt and kleptocratic. So that is at the level of the international and the external debt. But we also have challenges with regards to domestic debt, where citizens have been forced to assume debt incurred by politicians for their reckless spending and personal spending through debt assumption. As an example, we have the debt assumption bill, where expenses that were incurred by politicians, the judiciary, parliament, the executive, in agriculture mechanization loans, they never paid them back. 10 years later, a bill was introduced in parliament which forced citizens to shoulder the expenses or the lavish lifestyle that politicians had incurred. So I think these are two cases, one with regards to external debt, where in the process of busting sanctions and looking for lucrative ways of mobilizing resources, opportunities for grant theft, opportunities for kleptocratic tendencies have emerged, and these practices have been perfected. And in my context, some of it has been used in the region as the legacy of what Mugabe left has been exported into the region, with my country providing mentorship and peer support to other kleptocratic governments who want to learn a thing or two about how to enrich yourselves using public resources. Thank you. I'll leave it here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, beloved. But you bring in another very interesting perspective as well. I think all of you made reference to the IMF. What is the role of IMF in this war mess that we see? They come in and we actually look up to the IMF as a last resort, an institution of last resort, the land of last resort for governments and so forth, to bail themselves out of economic crisis. You said that you are going to the IMF for the 17th time. And for Argentina, 25 times.
More than 25.
And the situation remains the same. Or even getting worse, let me say. Gary, I want to put you on the spotlight. I'm sorry. You are closer home to the IMF, to the World Bank headquarters. How best can we look to the IMF and speak to them about sustainable debt restructuring mechanisms? And what is the role of IMF in this whole mess? Maybe you can start on that point.
Yeah, no, critical question. And let me say three things, which I think help put it a little bit in perspective. You've heard these stories. And by the way, these are not individual stories that we just found 3 countries that happen to be in problem, right? So this is a systemic issue across many, many countries. And let me say 3 things. One is, when aid money is lost, it's tragic because there is lost opportunity. When loan money is lost or stolen, it's exacerbating the problem because not only have you lost the opportunity for economic development and for certain needed services, but now you've saddled, as Beloved noted, you've saddled these countries and the citizens with debt for generations. And so it's even worse. The second thing that I want to say is there is now very strong evidence that those countries that perform lower on the World Bank's Governance Index, Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, and a number of other, the Freedom House's indexes, that those that perform, well, depending upon the sort of standard, but below average, let's put it that way,
yep,
have gone through multiple debt programs. Those that are in the upper half, except for 1 or 2, have largely gone through 1 in the last 20 years. And so, when we hear about 17 or 25 debt restructuring, I think I was talking to folks at Ghana, they're in their 22nd, maybe, debt restructuring.
Wow.
So we know that the corruption link to failed loan programs is pretty clear. So that's the second thing. And the third is really up to us, is to understand if we are going to engage the IMF, because the IMF, as much as we have this sort of difficulty and struggling with the IMF, we need to push to reform them because they are a lender of last resort. Historically, we've seen the IMF institute conditionalities that have not, what I think many of us in this room and outside would agree have been helpful. Cut social services, raise taxes on individuals, because the goal is just the ability to pay back the debt.
Yes.
Right? That doesn't actually create a sustainable or an inclusive economy. We don't see shared prosperity. We see quote-unquote successful countries because there are countries that have successfully paid back their debt, and yet they have some of the lowest per capita incomes in the world. And so we need to change the way we think about conditionalities and reforms. When we first went to the IMF to work on the Sri Lanka problem, we were literally told, hey, you people in the anti-corruption community are on a different page than the human rights community. If we do what you want to do and institute conditionalities, they're going to come yell at us. So we went and we talked to Human Rights Watch and Human Rights First and Amnesty International, Oxfam, and we said, what is that about? And they said, no, for them to say that is an insult. We are against conditionalities that harm people, conditionalities that will require money and help to guide money to actually be productive. We're on board, sign us on, and we got a letter to counter that kind of nonsense that they were talking about. So we need to rethink the way in which the IMF can play a positive role, because right now, I would argue, and we're starting to change, and I think there's some people in the IMF that are starting to understand this, but we're not there yet, that there is a positive role they can play in moving these countries forward and helping to push reforms. One other thing I will say real quick, and then I will yield to my colleagues, is that we have also started to undertake conversations with private bondholders. Because as much as the IMF gives, more money is coming from private bondholders. I think in Sri Lanka, you're getting $3 billion from the IMF, probably $6 billion from private bondholders. We have talked to them about, and this is a longer conversation, but I'm just going to raise it for people's awareness without going into the details, but a governance-linked bond. That is, governments that would agree in private financing to institute governance and transparency reforms, it is a safer investment for them, and they would be willing to reduce the cost of financing. So as we're thinking about debt, how do we reduce the cost of financing and make it more likely that countries can manage their debt? These are the kinds of creative solutions we're trying to work on. It is very difficult, and I don't want to overstate the progress, but I do want to say that there has been a change in the way that some people have been approaching this, and does give us some reason to double down and try and move the thing forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Back to you now, Dishan. I hear clearly the role of the international financial institutions. Clearly, we've laid out as well the role that our governments have played in terms of the failure to manage sustainable debt levels. But equally, I think as citizens, we have a role. Citizens have a role in this whole process. We are not just spectators. I think we are the main actors because citizens are the taxpayers. What role can citizens or civil society organizations, citizen groupings play in order to reverse this whole crisis?
In countries where there is a state capture, kleptocracy type of situation, it's going to be a fight that the citizens or civil society will have to give to even get the right to talk about debt. While they are the ones who are affected, they are the ones who have to pay, take the brunt. They are kept out of this equation. And it is sad because it is sad because even the international financial institutions, when they come in before these agreements are signed, they're supposed to do rounds of consultations. To what extent do they talk to people, talk to civil society? I don't know whether IMF colleagues are here, but we've said this to them. To the face directly, we've challenged them. We feel it's just a box-ticking exercise. You're talking about such critical problems that have deeply affected people, have cost the lives of people, and you give them 3 minutes in a 1-hour conversation. In a 1-hour conversation. You've come all the way to our country, traveling for around 20 hours. Why do you want to only have a 1-hour conversation with civil society actors? And they are representing diverse sectors. They have a lot to tell you. And in order to make you understand, you need to give us a little time to explain the situation, because our culture is sometimes completely different to the culture from where you're coming from. We have, corruption is part and parcel of the culture. So that's why sometimes we have come across pieces of legislation that are now coming out as part of the IMF agreement, where we've been able to bring in many of governance reforms as part of the agreement the IMF has included. And IMF and the World Bank sit with the drafting committees providing technical assistance. The government has always been, our government, very, very hesitant, almost it's a zero in terms of sharing the draft laws. whereas our Right to Information Act makes it mandatory that they actually, they should give the drafts if the citizens ask for it. You don't have to wait till it's done and dusted, then there's no time for us to review it. However, even after filing RTIs, we are not even given the draft. But finally, after going public, and finally when we get hold of the draft, which is coming after the technical assistance, we've caught areas of huge, like major gaps in the law, where you can very deviously do business as usual, although the face of the law looks good, but we are able to catch that because we are in the country and we know how the system works or how the system is rigged. So in terms of the role that civil society can play, it is critical, it is essential, it should not be optional. And of course, the government should be getting us in, but obviously in a state capture situation, they are not going to take us in. They have some co-opted few organizations whom they bring in to all these forums to tick the box saying, we consult as civil society, but that's not, and the institutions that are the other party to these conversations need to also know you're not talking to a government that is accepted by the people, you're not known to be having integrity, so you need to go an extra mile to create the space to get the valuable input. I mean, Sri Lanka does not lack professionals, does not lack academia. In fact, we are being headhunted by other countries, our professionals. So we have the in-house expertise to give to all the laws and the reforms, and we come from a place of working close to the people where the pain is felt. And also, so in terms of the role of the people, they've been even more distant in this whole debt conversation. They don't even because our debt, as at March 2024, $100 billion US dollars, you can't even put the zeros there when you convert into LKR. So it just goes above our head. So some of us now, what we are trying to do in terms of our public awareness raising interventions is to simplify this big number into examples that hit home. Like we say, if this amount we are paying in terms of this interest for these loans that have ended up in white elephant projects, nobody is benefiting from that. Airport, no planes are coming there. They were like those propaganda projects. If that money could have been utilized to develop this amount of hospitals in these regions, provide, increase the number of teachers, give drinking water access, develop this road. Now then they're able to figure out, oh my goodness, this is terrible. So there's a lot of this communication to do, and while we do this, the government is misusing state media, and they even have money to plant, use digital means like through bots, social media, and they are giving misinformation. They're confusing people about it. So you have to, in addition to giving awareness, you have to keep countering the confusion that's deliberately caused also. But more and more people are picking it up, Joy, and it's a good thing. People are asking for accountability, not transparency to start with. First of all, we don't even know. And since now it became part of the IMF conditions, now there is a debt bulletin, that's put out with an update and a breakdown, but then it still will be too technical for the ordinary citizen. So then the civil society takes that, puts it into infographics, simplifies it, explains questions, how it came about. So that's the role.
Thank you very much. Pablo, I want to come back to you, back on one of your recommendations, and again, building on what Nadishan is just highlighting. It's one thing to give information to the citizens, but another thing to also tool them to use that information in terms of engagement with the duty bearers, with the lawmakers. In your experiences, and I also want to bring in the issue of, because she highlighted the issue of misinformation, how do we verify that the information we are receiving from our duty bearers is actually correct? How do we verify? What is the case for debt audit at country level, and also the role of our citizens in all that?
Okay. I think that is essential to adopt a series of measures that guarantee responsible in the management, accountability, and the clear communication of the financial situation in our countries. We think some recommendations about development, for example, and appropriate regulatory frameworks, and that is crucial to create clear laws that define, for example, all type of debt. We have different kinds of debt in our countries. We think that we need improvement, the operations and good practice, implementing transparent debt strategies and policies supervised by the parliament, that it's have a role key in this discussion. We need strong legislation to ensure transparency. Laws should require a full disclosure of debt information, for example, strategies, contracts, obligations, etc., and make it especially accessible for all the people in the society. And talking about society and going to your second question, the role the civil society is very important and diverse. This is not only necessary to supervise and advocate for transparency and accountability, but also to actively participate in decision making about the reason for taking credits, the terms and conditions, the development of a strategic management and transparency plan, the policies implemented to meet the commitment, and how and what the money is used for. This is very important for poor countries, especially. In summary, civil society can monitor and supervise through policies, advocate for the development of a legal framework and policies that ensure public access to debt, relate information, promote transparency and accountability, participate in decision-making process, promoting citizen participation mechanisms related to public debt management, supervision committees, public hearings, citizen consultations, and finally participate in the development of a public debt policy plans and strategies.
Thank you very much. Very critical. I'll give, I believe, 2 minutes for you. Your recommendations on reversing the effects of klepto debt in our countries. Then we want to give an opportunity to interact with our audience for questions and answers.
Thank you. I think among the biggest measures which civil society can take is to make a connection between debt and the material conditions of the people in our various countries. Because at times that they disconnect, it appears that it's the government that is in arrears with no consequences for my health and education. So I think there's a need for better articulation of the nexus between the two so that citizens are able to participate. I was following the protests in Kenya, for example, around the finance bill. You can see that the citizens are able to connect how the finance bill is affecting their material conditions. So it doesn't become a superfluous connection between the two, especially in light of the heavy investment by kleptocratic regime in disinformation and misinformation to the citizens who ordinarily have limited access to information, especially in countries where the bulk of the population lives in rural areas where the only source of information is radio, and all radio stations are controlled by the state. So in such a situation, it becomes difficult for citizens to participate in any measures to push back on this accumulation and corruption within it, because they actually don't know how it's panning out. And then second, they don't connect this huge debt overhang to why they don't have medicine in the clinic and why schools are dysfunctional. So I think civil society has a role to better articulate that connection, but also to put all hands on deck to ensure that they bring and crowd in other actors so that it becomes collaborative action instead of civil society on its own. You realize that there are entities like churches and some faith groups and women's youth groups who the state is less inclined towards using its repressive measures. So if you crowd them in, you proof the civil society movement from what ordinarily would have been possible attacks on whatever civil society is doing by bringing in a broad church of actors who can serve a similar purpose. And the third point will be around evidencing. For Zimbabwe example, the debt ranges from 13 to 28 billion. No one knows exactly how much it is. So how do you do work in a situation where there is a $10 billion range gap within which you want to estimate how much the country owes? And it's not clear to who, including the concept of for these resource-based loans, where people have just mortgaged natural resources to some foreign entities, including some aligned actors who are using these opportunities to push their strategic corruption objectives. Yeah, so I think the connection and using evidence would help us to do more of the work. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you very much. I want to continue to thank you all for staying with us on this panel, but to invite questions for the panelists here, contributions as well. So I'll take, I see one hand up already. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Beauty Emefanate, the Executive Secretary for the Ghana Anti-Corruption Coalition. I want to share Ghana's perspective in terms of this discussion. So the Ghanaian CSOs in 2014 came together to find a seat and a table for ourselves, even though we're not invited. So if you look at Ghana's previous IMF engagements, CSOs were clearly missing from that debate. But we realized that until we make ourselves relevant in that space, we will not be heard and will not be taken seriously. So in 2014, we formed what we call the CSOs on the IMF platform to help us to monitor and then engage in the IMF process. And after Ghana we went off the IMF, we decided to change our name to Economic Governance Platform so that we can look at the economic issues and monitor them. Little did we know that we'll be going back to the IMF last year when we have to go back. The point has to be made that when it comes to debt, government assumes ownership of debt in ways that citizens are not included. It's sad to say that at a point, it was even not clear how much we're owing, neither did we even know who we are indebted to. There was a lot of disagreements and debates about how much Ghana owed. It was just because of the IMF conditions that helped us last year to even come to a conclusion that this is how much we owed. And even that, government started trying to, when even citizens thought that we should go to the IMF, because at that point we saw that the only way to manage government's appetite for borrowing is to go back to the IMF. Government navigated that space by introducing another tax burden on citizens, which is the e-levy, electronic levy that government imposed on citizens, even though citizens clearly said no to this. But government went ahead to do that, thinking that they were able to mobilize enough resource from the e-levy so that they can go back to borrowing. So you can see that there's no constraint when it comes to borrowing, and government does not have a limit in terms of how much they borrow and how much. Even currently, our Bank of Ghana made losses, but they're still rewarding themselves. And government, through the IMF negotiations, decided that they would do the domestic debt restructuring. And guess what? What we call it haircuts were given to citizens, but government declined our offer of even reducing the size of government. When even our neighbors, Cote d'Ivoire, decided to reduce the number of its government, the size of government, our government, it's even adding more. In fact, as I speak, we even have 2 finance ministers now. We have a finance minister, and then we have another one at the presidency. So in terms of government's appetite for debt, there are a lot of things that are put in the place of government to do what they want to do, regardless of what citizens' sentiments are. And that is why we think that there's a lot we can do, one, to put some checks and balances in terms of government borrowing. Unfortunately, the oversight that is provided by Parliament is weak. Debts are, loans are approved in a matter of days, not weeks. So you usually get debts approved under the certificate of urgency, and it doesn't give even parliamentarians time to scrutinize. So they just thumbprint and check the box for government to continue its borrowing. But the point has to be made that debts affect the country and the future of the citizens. So we need to find clear ways to monitor debts, and that's why currently we are putting in a debt tracker where we want to monitor government's debt so that we can help citizens to understand and see the implications, and we don't have to wait for another debt restructuring. And maybe I should even say this. When the debt issue was coming, the middle class didn't really see it as a personal thing, but the haircuts that we receive, I'm happy to say that most of the people who were affected were the middle class. And suddenly, they became interested, and they are. So even though it was an unfortunate situation, it has helped us to get the attention of and commitment of the middle class to also advocate for certain things, measures to be put in place. We have our former what's her name? Sophia Akufu, who is our former, not Attorney General, Chief Justice. We had a former Chief Justice marching and campaigning against debt, in fact, the domestic debt restructuring, because people who were on pension were affected, and she had to solidarize with them. So this is how people have now taken it as personal and have found a way to ensure that government does not continue its debt appetite. So we need to cap debts. We need to find ways to restrict debts. We need to find ways to make the debts that are incurred, not just debt that they will be used to flourish, and lavish lifestyles, but debt that will be used for citizens' interests, because citizens ultimately will be responsible for those debts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I gave you extra time because one colleague from Ghana was supposed to be joining us, but could not get the visa on time. So I was happy to let you go for longer time. But otherwise, other incoming questions can just make it a brief. Thank you so much, Executive Secretary from Ghana. Another question, I see one here. Another. So those 2 interventions, thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Leslie Tsai with the Chandler Foundation, and I wanted to share a recent conversation amongst a group of philanthropists regarding this debt issue, and I'd love some of some reactions from the panel. So it was a conversation amongst philanthropists and funders interested in debt sustainability as it relates to climate. And the conversation there was all about debt sustainability and how the fault is with the Western donor community and with private creditors. We need to build in mechanisms to regarding climate change, small island nations that have gone into a debt crisis at no fault of their own because of climate change, because of the pandemic, XYZ. So kind of this counter narrative. And some of the funders even went so far to say we need to put money into changing the narrative that is saying it is the fault of the borrowing countries, that they are corrupt, this is a colonial, racist narrative, and we need to put money into changing that narrative. And I was almost embarrassed to raise my hand and say, oh, we work on this corruption and debt crisis link. So I'm just curious, because there's a group of funders, but also civil society organizations working on climate change, maybe in your countries and other countries, that are going to people with influence and power and saying, we need to move away from this corruption narrative. So how do we work together with funders with money and also with civil society with influence and other interests to work together to say this is a holistic problem, we need to incorporate governance conditionalities, mechanisms, as well as environmental. How do we take all of these things into account and work together? Just as Gary had mentioned, we don't work against these human rights organizations; we work with them, and the same with climate change organizations and others.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panel. I just wanted to chime in on the role of civil society and say that probably in trying the debt transparency, I think we've also been found complicit because we have left the conversations really at a very high level. In as much as we try, I think there's a lot of rhetoric. The conversations and the narratives are still created by economists. And they are very much financialized. It's at a very financial level. What's the debt stock? It's now 22 billion. But what does it exactly mean? I don't think we have put in as much effort in terms of breaking it down and putting the human face to it. To say, so here is a girl, here is a person with a disability or a girl out of school, all the conversations that you're saying. I think we still need to up our game in that regard to make it a political question. I'm not talking about partisan politics, but a political economy question that when this is happening, it's an issue of class struggles. These are the people that are actually suffering while this is happening. I don't think we have really broken it down to that level. The other thing is about operating in silos. I think the debt justice movement is standing there, the tax justice movement is standing there, the climate justice is there, the environmental justice is there. We have not brought and synchronized the issues for the nexus bit that we are talking about. I think there are so many intersectionalities around these issues. If you're talking climate financing, how do you bring in the debt question? Tax justice, what does it mean when it comes to debt? As taxpayers, we are the ones who then pay and all this. I think we have continued to operate in silos. And efforts are not very strong. And it's also about probably the competition for the very small slice of the cake in terms of the money. So we actually compete in our different turfs, and what is sexy now is climate change, it's environment, it's all this, or it's human rights, whatever it is at that particular point in time. I think the agenda continues to be set elsewhere, and we then operate kind of in silos. My third and last point is about building allies, and sometimes it's very unusual allies. And I'm talking about this, taking from our own experience from the organization that brought me here. There was a time when we were having a constitutional amendment, and it relates to the issue of oversight by institutions. And the constitution was being amended, and there was a clause in there that was going to take away the oversight role of Parliament for agreements signed by the President or the Minister of Finance, foreign agreements, and that included the issue of debt. We had to do the unusual in terms of the advocacy work. It did not take workshops to sit down in grandstanding and all, but really one-on-one with parliamentarians, even from the political party we thought would not understand this and be part of it. But at the end of the day, actually, that clause was one, and clause 23 was removed from that bill, from the constitutional amendment bill. So it also really takes policy advocacy that is different from the way that civil society we are used to doing it, and building those allies in the institutions that play the oversight role when it comes to public finance management. I just wanted to raise this, at least sitting from the civil society, but also noting the sins that we have committed in promoting or perpetuating this crisis that we actually have. Thank you.
Thank you. One last intervention, then I'll come back to the panel. And if there is more burning, we can have another 5 or 10 minutes to come back.
Good morning. My name is Franklin de Vries. I'm with the Westminster Foundation for Democracy, and I want to follow up to the previous point in terms of finding allies for reform. So when we speak about governance reforms and bringing more transparency, I want to raise the question to the members of the panel how you think about the role of parliaments and legislators in bringing more accountability. And reference was made to parliamentarians of ruling parties, but I think also the role of parliamentarians of opposition parties can be important, because the issue which we are facing is very much one of executive dominance, and dominance in terms of decision making, but also in terms of dominance of the information they're sitting on, which is not being shared. So I would be interested in views with regards to what can be a constructive role of parliamentarians with regards to that transparency. And then second, how you think about conditionality from lenders, bilateral lenders as well as private lenders and international organizations with regards to full transparency to Parliament as a conditionality in restructuring and in loans as well as another mechanism to bring more transparency. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll give this opportunity to panelists to respond. So I'll open it up to you, and you want to start?
Sure. Great questions and comments. First of all, really appreciate it, and I particularly appreciate the notice on silos and having to sort of think that traditional model. Let me say, I'm going to address 2 points in particular. I'll leave the Parliament stuff and some of the other issues to my colleagues. I do think that as we are trying to convince at least the IMF to engage more, so my colleagues from Ghana talking about how do we get the IMF to engage civil society at the outset rather than these check-the-box exercises during the process. And I think that that's where our partnership with Sri Lanka worked quite well, where they drove the policy and the reform agenda, but enlisted us to help to move the U.S. to pressure the IMF to engage more with Sri Lanka civil society. We even brought some of Nadi's colleagues from Sri Lanka to the U.S. to brief the U.S. Congress and organize members of the U.S. Congress to put pressure on the IMF. So looking at it as a whole political ecosystem, I think working together, understanding how we could help support the work of in-country activists in the U.S. and potentially in some EU countries in the UK, that we could begin to change the political math. So that's one comment I'd like to make. To Leslie's comment on climate, I do think we need to rethink how we're going to finance the needs, right, in the emerging markets. And there, the IMF and I think the World Bank have estimated that despite all the money and the aid that's going into these countries, about 80% of what's needed is likely to come from the private sector. And so we have to engage the private sector. And there we have been working, again, also with bondholders, some very significant bondholders in emerging markets, to create a new type of bond. Climate bonds have largely failed because they're very expensive, they're unaccountable, and quite frankly, countries aren't floating them. And so working with them to add reforms and provisions to create accountability, limit greenwashing, and then again, and this is a longer-term issue, but we are working with, if we create a bond that has integrity, working with the U.S. government to back those bonds and provide guarantees, which could lower the cost of financing by as much as half, which then you begin to look at financing that's far more affordable for these countries. And so with sovereign debt guarantees from the U.S. and bonds with integrity, then working with our partners around the world to get countries to float those bonds and hopefully meet those needs with a lot of lower cost financing. There's a lot more to it, and I'm happy to go into more of it, but we are trying to think about creative and innovative solutions to deal with it and bringing in some of the players that traditionally have not engaged. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Over to you, beloved.
Thank you, John. I think I'll attempt the parliament question. The challenge now with this kleptocratic regime is that the parliaments, the way they are constituted, is not based on merit. You realize that these networks that are within the system promote to parliament people who may not be able to engage in meaningful ways with these debt issues as a first point. The second point, at least for my country, the parliamentary whipping system, where they first gather somewhere, agree on a position which is driven by the ruling party or some other entity, reduces the individual agents of parliamentarians, which then becomes some mobocracy of sorts, playing out in parliament, preventing a real debate on issues. So ideally, parliament would have lots of role to play, but I think the way that the institutions have been functioning and delivering is inhibited by these two factors which I've touched on. I think I want to agree with Janet on bringing actors together. I think the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development is a good model where a number of actors have been brought together and use their various skills, leverage, and access to push the debt agenda in different spaces, local, regional, and national. And then on the issue of making the connection between debt and lived realities, I think we have a new phenomenon which I think also plays a role in diminishing the role of civil society, which is alternative service delivery models which citizens have opted for. Instead of confronting corruption and its impact on delivery of services like water, electricity, refuse collection, etc., and roads, there are different service delivery models, alternative, which are privately financed through different models, which disconnect citizens from participating in the broader governance framework in which their resources are being collected for and looted from there. So they are more concerned with these private arrangements of service delivery where they are benefiting from, and they even have more oversight over how their residents' association of their compound is running their resources than how national government is conducting. So I think these alternative service delivery models, where they are good to improve the conditions of people, they have disconnected people from service delivery at the highest level and reduced their capacity to participate in decision-making and in influencing policies that ordinarily would reduce corruption from the national pot to benefit them, and they are now more focusing on this local level alternative service delivery models.
Thank you.
So in addition to what my colleagues have mentioned, in terms of bringing different parties together, like I mentioned before, I think in our latest intervention with regard to the governance diagnostic, we were able to do that. And I think, in a way, it was a first time that civil society actors in Sri Lanka, working on diverse sectors, came together demanding an end to corruption and governance reform for good governance. And in leading to that, we actually organized like a big sort of something like a workshop where we invited civil society representatives from all over the country working in different sectors, and we took them through the content of like why we say for human rights, corruption, elimination of corruption will be a precondition for the attainment of human rights. If you are interested in democracy, as long as there are corrupt actors who rule, they don't like democracy. Like we explained, we took them and it was a discussion. And I remember one lady came up to me during a break and said, I worked for women and children for now decades, and today is the first time that I looked at the problem of governance and corruption in this way, and I feel like it was insightful, and I see the connection, and I thank you for making us see this. And so they all signed up saying we will support. I think unfortunately, the dark period that Sri Lanka had to go through did hit, on the heads of people to realize that there is a governance problem and none of us can escape it. There is a statement in our local language which normal people say to evade any responsibility for being interested in politics. It says, if you earn, you will eat. Like it is to say, let the government do whatever. It's not my problem. If I earn only, I can eat. So what happened, and it's a normal statement that people use to say they're not interested in politics. But what happened with the economic crisis is that they realized I am not even allowed to earn. I can't. So, so then we started using that and saying, even though you are not interested in politics always interested in you, it's going to come and bite you. And this was the same thing that we said to the private sector. So in this way, we were able to get a bigger group, and I think that is a strength. And parallel to all of this, we've been giving leadership, and I think it's important also to step forward to give leadership to civil society coalitions. It's not easy at all. They have their own issues with one another, but we try to show them the greater cause and agree on one slogan that we all can support. And we advocated against the continuous infringement of the rights in the last year or more. Against freedom of expression, the government has been harming that and trying to bring in oppressive laws. So what we realized was there's no point only TISL putting a press release. It's not powerful enough because this is an entire big regime that is having many actors who are having a bigger game here, and they love to divide and rule, but our strength is when we come together. So we all civil society leaders from diverse sectors sat together, we convened the diplomatic community, sat together, we convened parliamentarians. They came because, all of us were together inviting them, and we all spoke, and we said, this is one thing we want you to focus right now. This is our priority, and that helps. And yes, working with parliamentarians, as is very important. As TISL, it's a complete one sector of work. It's easy to just call all of them corrupt, but that is not how it works. While I say there's a kleptocracy and while I say there's state capture, given in every situation, for example, the opposition supports us when we want to critique a law. I mean, when they come into power, that story can change. But when this is advocacy, right? And within the government, we found a couple of people who resonates, I mean, who understand, they are divided, they know their leadership has a different mind, but they help us with whatever they can do. They at least try to get us a meeting with the minister. They will say, okay, these points I can push. So sometimes it's just sitting with them and giving them, selling the idea to them. And I think we cannot give up working with the public representatives. So I think those are a couple of comments.
Thank you very much. Any additional?
Yes, only a short note. I like this discussion because we are part of civil society, we are part of the parliament, we have some representatives of the government, and it's important that this discussion about debt incorporate all our view. Of course, the parliament have a key role in these discussions, but not only sanctions law, they need to control, they need stay and work during the signing of the contract, and of course later control the contract and the situation. There is a challenge in the incorporation of parliament and civil society, especially for the care of citizens. This is a very big discussions with different actors, and we need to incorporate this kind of meetings. Is important to talk about one thing that it was exclusively discussed for a short group of people, and I think that civil society, parliament, and academy, journalists need to join to discuss and especially have information about debt and countries.
Thank you.
Just make a quick point on Leslie.
A quick one. All right.
I mean, I think on Leslie's point, I think that's a very dangerous trend. If countries try to put the entire blame on the creditors, or, I think we should just say you need two hands to clap in almost every type of corruption as well. And it can even be a narrative that would be very well taken and amplified by the corrupt actors. They would love it. Put the entire blame on the West. So I think we need to counter it and not let it grow. I'm glad that I'm not still hearing that in Sri Lanka, but and people are very much actually talking about corruption. But here the challenge is to also tell people you also have a role to play. It's not only the politicians or the public officials, and also of course people do realize we elected them. So I think it's really important to not allow that to grow, and we can give evidence of corruption, or there is a lot of evidence coming out about scandals, so they cannot deny that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking at our time, but I'll squeeze in one last contribution from the floor. Then we round up.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Diego Rivetti. I work for the World Bank. I'm the editor of a book on debt transparency that was published some time ago.
Wow.
So a contribution, I think it's very important not to look at that in isolation. So that stock is the result of, typically years of basically fiscal performance. I always suggest people to look at the debt sustainability analysis. There is a nice table that explains how we got there, Mm-hmm. and disaggregate the different drivers. Is it because of the fiscal? Is it because there's been a banking crisis or an FX devaluation? And typically it's fiscal. So fiscal is the main driver of that. And if it's fiscal, then we have to look also at the budget transparency. How are the governments spending their money? So the link between debt transparency and budget transparency is crucial. And let's suppose that a country, a corrupt government, still want to kind of dodge the budget and and undertake an opaque transaction, no, it needs always a corrupt creditor. No, there must be someone on the other side ready, to give you the money in an opaque way. And that's why I think we should not blame IFIs too much. IFIs have, the way to provide money in a transparent way. There are other creditors that probably should be on the spotlight. No, there are other creditors, and I like the fact that it was mentioned the resource-backed loans. No, more and more countries try to get their funds through these opaque transactions. Domestic debt is another source of possibly opaque debt. So probably, if we look at that from the angle of transparency, we have to kind of shift the attention towards this kind of transaction rather than, World Bank or IMF that have more or less oversight mechanism in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention coming through from the World Bank. We need to round up on time. Just for us, our quick takeaways from this conversation is I think my panelists here who highlighted the drivers of klepto debt in different parts of the world. Key drivers being the governance crisis, lack of fiscal transparency. He has been quite repeatedly as one of the key drivers. Limited citizen participation as well in the governance processes. Misinformation coming out very clear as one of the key drivers as well of this particular crisis we find ourselves. So there are two things: misinformation and lack of access to information. Sometimes there is deliberate, dissemination of wrong information to lead citizens to think otherwise, and therefore evade from being accountable. Other drivers, I think active drivers, we heard about, domestic debt through things like mechanisms like debt assumption, your resource-backed loans, in a very opaque way. Issue of sanctions busting, I think is something that we need on a different conversation on the role of sanctions on developing countries and the emerging debt crisis. How do we deal with that? And lastly, I'm sure we cannot also run away from the role of international financial institutions. I think the element of responsible lending must also be highlighted. How do you keep on lending to struggling jurisdictions that are not showing governance reforms, and you keep lending to such countries? What sort of conditionalities are we framing for the countries that we're actually lending? Are we clearing debts to increase further lending, and on what conditions? These are some of the conversations. Key solutions, I think we talked about increased citizen participation, access to information, tracking the debt. I liked the intervention that came through around developing a debt tracker from Ghana there. And most important for me was how we had, the Anti-Corruption Commission, anti-corruption agencies working together with civil society organizations, working together with government agencies to monitor debt. Very, very important there. And also looking out to other, they call them unusual alliances. She put it well. It takes two hands to clap always. So it's not a role that can be confined to one person, to one particular actor, one sector, but to all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for taking part in this panel. And once again, you help me to thank my panelists for unpacking this conversation. Thank you.